So what we're going to do now is we're going to revisit the implementation of the Zippy microservice, and this will show how you can use a custom SQL query, and it'll show both parallel and sequential uses of the JPA, and so there's some interesting things there in terms of performance and so on. So you can find this, as always, in my EX4 project, in the web MVC folder, in my live listens GitHub repository. So now we're in the EX4 project in the web MVC folder, and let's go ahead and take a look at a few things. First of all, here's the base controller. Most of this is the same as what we looked at before, with one important addition. We added this new searchEx endpoint handler method to the base controller, and as you can see, it just goes ahead and will forward to the underlying searchEx service method. And the underlying searchEx service method basically will do whatever you tell it to do, and that will be what we're going to look at. So let's go over here to ZippyService. Here's ZippyService. It implements base service. Most of these calls are what we looked at before. Here's the one that we handcrafted, which is the find all by quote containing ignore case all in method in the JPA quote repository. Here is the JPA quote repository. As you can see, it implements, or it extends JPA repository and multi-query repository. And if we look at multi-query repository, you can see it has this rather verbose set of names, which don't work, unfortunately, out of the box with the JPA and Spring Data API, but that's OK. So we're going to implement the multi-query repository impl, and that's going to do the thing to do the queries. Now, keep in mind what we're doing here is we are putting together a query programmatically that will return all the quote objects in the quote table, in the quote database, that contain all of the queries that we pass as a list. So that's what we're doing. First thing we do is we use persistence context to auto-wire an entity manager, which is basically the database session that keeps track of everything. And then we implement the method. And you can see there's basically 4 lines here that kind of set things up. And so the first thing we do is we use the entity manager that we auto-wired to get something called a criteria builder. You'll see how that gets used in a second. Then we use the criteria builder to help us create a criteria query object that's going to work on the quote class. And we're going to use that to build our queries. And then we come down here and we say, hey, criteria query, please get me something called a root object that knows about the quote class. So we get this root object, and we call that quote. And that's going to allow us to be able to search in that particular table. And then we use all the stuff we have so far, including the quote and the criteria builder, to create ourselves something called a quote expression. And the quote expression is going to go ahead and look up the column field in this quote root quote object. It's going to basically get back something that corresponds to the column field for quote column field. And it's going to treat it in a lowercase form. So we have a lowercase quote expression. So that allows us to be able to do things that will be case insensitive. And then what we're going to do, and this is really the cool part, is we're going to take the queries that were passed in, that's that list of strings up here, and we're going to take the criteria builder and the quote expression, and we're going to call a little method called getPredicate. And what getPredicate does, and this is the part where ChatGPT was invaluable to fine-tune the Java streams expression of this. It's going to take the list of queries, turn it into a stream of queries, then it's going to map each of the queries to lowercase, so case insensitive. And then we're going to map this thing to the criteria builder like method. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a predicate that matches the quote column of the quote entity, and it's going to basically take each of the queries, each of these words, like if it's Zippy the pinhead, it would be yow, or fun, or pinhead, or whatever you want your Zippy quotes to contain. And it's going to take that and it's going to create a predicate that will do a wildcard search for that query in a lower-cased way. And it's going to give you back a predicate that does like. Remember, like is this way that you can kind of check for things that are like something. It's kind of like a regular expression wildcard search. So we're going to end up with a stream of predicates, one predicate for every query. And then we're going to use the reduce terminal operation to create ourselves a composite query, which is going to go over here just a tad, going to AND everything together. I should probably pull that down here so it's a little easier to read. So you can see here that this is going to go ahead and AND all those predicates together using the criteria builder AND operator. And we're going to make it a conjunction, which means it'll be an AND, which means if things don't match, it's going to fail. So that is going to return a single predicate, which is basically the conjunction of all the queries treated as wildcards. So now we have the AND predicate. And then we take the AND predicate and the criteria query, and we call the getResults method, which is just a little helper. And what this does is it says, add the AND predicate, should be the AND predicate, to the criteria query where clause, which returns the quote if it matches all the specified queries that are now turned into like predicates. So we're going to have this where and predicate, and then we're going to create a query from that. So this thing has now got a query that does all that stuff. And then we use that query, and we say, please query the database using those predicates, that predicate conjunction, and return the list of things that correspond to that. Now, I think you will agree with me that this is kind of cool. The use of Java streams makes it a lot more cogent than if you were trying to do something equivalent using classic Java for each loops and if-else statements and so on. However, it's still a lot of work, and so mercifully, the JPA and the Spring Data API largely shield us from this kind of stuff, except in cases like this where we just can't get it to work out of the box. So it's a nice enhancement. When you need this, it's there, but most of the time you don't need it unless you're doing something that's a little bit off the beaten track like we were trying to do here. So anyway, that is a walkthrough of this particular form of programmatically writing queries or building queries and running queries and so on with JPA and so on. And you'll need to understand variants of this for programming assignment 2B, where you're going to have to write some stuff like this in order to do some of the operations.